You know, after 40 years on this bench, I thought I had seen every kind of pain, every type of hardship that could walk through my courtroom doors. But on that cold Tuesday morning in March, a woman walked in carrying a burden so heavy, so unimaginably cruel, that it broke something inside me. What she told me about where she had been just 24 hours earlier, what had happened to her in the moment she should have been grieving, I still get tears in my eyes thinking about it. And when I heard the full story, when I understood what the universe had done to this poor soul, I had to make a decision that went beyond the law. Let me tell you exactly what happened that day, because this is a story about compassion, about humanity, and about what we owe each other when life delivers its cruelest blows. But before I tell you this whole story, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because what I'm about to share with you is something that needs to be heard. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single word of this. I've been a municipal court judge in Providence, Rhode Island, since 1985. That's 40 years of seeing people on their worst days, 40 years of listening to stories that would break your heart or make you believe in the goodness of humanity all over again. Every morning I wake up at 5:30. I make my coffee, strong and black, no sugar, just the way my father taught me when I was a boy. My father came to this country from Italy with nothing but $8 in his pocket and a dream that his children would have opportunities he never had. He worked construction his entire life, and he taught me something I've never forgotten. He said, "Frank, when you have power over people, that's when your character's tested. Use it wisely. Use it with mercy." I get to the courthouse every morning at 8:15 sharp. My clerk, Christina, has been with me for 23 years, and she knows my routine better than I do. She has my case files organized on my desk. She knows I need those first few minutes with my coffee to center myself before I put on the robe, and she can read my mood just by the way I walk through the door. That Tuesday morning, March 14th, I remember walking in and feeling the cold seeping into my bones. It was one of those bitter New England mornings where the wind comes off the water and cuts right through you. Christina looked up when I came in and said good morning. She had that look on her face, the one she gets when she knows we have some tough cases ahead. I asked her what we had on the docket, and she handed me the files. Traffic violations mostly, a few parking disputes, nothing that seemed out of the ordinary. But she said something to me that I remember clearly. She said, "Judge, there's one case this morning. The woman just lost her husband. Yesterday was the funeral." I looked at her and felt my chest tighten. I asked what she was cited for, and Christina told me it was a parking violation. I remember thinking to myself, this woman buried her husband yesterday, and today she has to come to court for a parking ticket. I sat down at my desk and went through the files. I saw her name, Sarah Mitchell, and I read the citation. It was issued the day after her husband's funeral. The day after. I felt anger rising in me, not at her, but at the cosmic cruelty of it all. At the timing, at the fact that in her darkest hour she had to worry about a parking ticket and a court appearance. I made a note on her file. I wanted to hear her story directly. I wanted to look into her eyes and let her know that the law has room for compassion, that justice isn't just about rules, it's about understanding the human beings standing before you. At 9 o'clock I walked into my courtroom. It's not a large room, not like you see on television with the soaring ceilings and marble columns. It's modest, functional, with rows of wooden benches where people wait for their cases to be called. The American flag stands to my right, and the Rhode Island state flag to my left. I've presided over thousands of cases in this room. I've seen people at their absolute worst and their surprising best. I've seen arrogance and humility, lies and raw honesty. And I've learned that every single person who walks through that door has a story, and that story matters. I looked out at the gallery that morning and saw maybe 20 people waiting. Some looked nervous, some looked annoyed, some looked resigned to their fate. My eyes moved across the faces until they landed on a woman sitting in the third row. She was alone. She wore a simple black dress and a cardigan that looked like it had been pulled on without much thought. Her hands were folded in her lap, and even from my bench, I could see she was trembling slightly. Her face was pale, and there were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and endless tears. I knew immediately this was Sarah Mitchell. I started calling cases. I handled a parking dispute between two neighbors who couldn't agree on whose car was over the line. I dealt with a speeding ticket for a young man who swore he was only going 5 over the limit. I listened to excuses and explanations, some genuine, some less so, and all the while I kept glancing at Sarah Mitchell, sitting there so still, so alone, like she was holding herself together by sheer force of will. At 10:45, Christina called her case. "Sarah Mitchell," she announced, and I watched the woman stand up slowly, like her legs weren't quite sure they would hold her. She walked to the front of the courtroom with small, careful steps. When she stood before my bench, she looked up at me, and I saw in her eyes a depth of pain I'll never forget. These weren't the eyes of someone worried about a fine. These were the eyes of someone who had lost everything. I looked down at the citation in front of me. I said, "Mrs. Mitchell, I see here you've been cited for parking in a restricted zone on March 13th. Is that correct?" My voice was gentle. I wanted her to know from my tone that I wasn't here to make her day worse. She nodded and said, "Yes, Your Honor," so quietly I could barely hear her. I asked her to tell me what happened, to explain the circumstances, and what she told me next I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. She took a breath, and I could see her struggling to keep her composure. She said, "Your Honor, March 12th was my husband's funeral. We were married for 32 years. He had cancer. It took him in 6 months. Her voice cracked on that last word, and I saw tears start to stream down her face. She didn't wipe them away. She just stood there and let them fall. I felt my own throat tighten. I've heard thousands of stories in this courtroom, but there's something about a widow's grief that cuts through every defense you build up as a judge. She continued, and I could hear the effort it took for her to speak. The funeral was at St. Mary's Church. My son drove in from Boston. My daughter came from Connecticut with her 2 children. We buried Michael at Swan Point Cemetery, the place where we used to walk on Sunday afternoons when things were good, when he was healthy. She stopped and closed her eyes, and I gave her time. I didn't rush her. In my courtroom, people get the time they need to tell their truth. After the burial, she went on, everyone came back to our house. My house. I can't call it our house anymore, can I? She looked at me with such lost confusion that I felt my heart break a little. People brought food. They told me stories about Michael. They meant well, but all I wanted was for everyone to leave so I could be alone with my grief. By evening, everyone was gone. My children wanted to stay, but I sent them home. I told them I needed to be alone. I leaned forward, listening to every word. I said, "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm so sorry for your loss. Please take your time." She nodded and wiped her eyes with a tissue she pulled from her purse. "That night," she said, "I couldn't sleep. I couldn't be in our bedroom. Everything there reminded me of him, his reading glasses on the nightstand, his robe hanging on the back of the door. I couldn't breathe in there. So at 2 a.m, I got in my car and I just drove." I understood that immediately. I've been married to my wife Joyce for 48 years. I can't imagine losing her. I can't imagine that kind of emptiness. I nodded for her to continue. "I drove to the places we used to go together," she said. "I drove past the restaurant where he proposed to me 40 years ago. I drove past the hospital where both our children were born. I drove past the park where we used to take them when they were little, and then I drove to the cemetery." She paused and took a shaky breath. "I parked outside the gates. They were closed, of course. It was 3 a.m, but I could see where we had buried him just hours before. I could see the fresh earth, and I sat in my car, and I talked to him. I told him I didn't know how to do this without him. I told him I was scared. I told him I was sorry for every argument we ever had, for every time I was impatient or unkind. I told him I loved him. The courtroom was absolutely silent. I could hear the clock on the wall ticking. I could hear someone in the back row sniffle quietly. I don't know how long I sat there, Mrs. Mitchell said. Maybe an hour, maybe two. I lost track of time. When I finally looked up, the sun was starting to rise. And that's when I saw the parking enforcement officer writing me a ticket. I was parked in what I guess is a restricted zone right outside the cemetery gates. I got out of my car and I tried to explain. I told him I had just buried my husband. I told him I wasn't thinking clearly, but he said he had to write the ticket. He said he was sorry, but rules are rules. I felt something hot surge through my chest. Anger, pure and simple. Not at Mrs. Mitchell, at a system that could be so cruel, so inflexible in the face of human suffering. I looked down at the citation again. The parking enforcement officer's signature was there. The timestamp showed 5:37 in the morning on March 13th, less than 12 hours after she had buried her husband. I looked back up at Mrs. Mitchell and I said, "Ma'am, let me make sure I understand this correctly. You buried your husband on March 12th. That night, overcome with grief, you drove to the cemetery in the early morning hours to be near him. And while you were sitting in your car, grieving, trying to find a way to go on, you were given a parking ticket." She nodded. "Yes, Your Honor," she whispered. "And the fine is $75, which I know isn't a lot of money, but right now, with the funeral expenses and the medical bills we're still paying, it feels like a mountain." I sat back in my chair and I had to take a moment. I've presided over thousands of cases. I've seen people try to manipulate the system, lie their way out of tickets, make up elaborate excuses for why the rules shouldn't apply to them. But I've also seen genuine hardship. I've seen people struggling against circumstances that would break most of us. And I've learned that my job isn't just to enforce the law mechanically. My job is to administer justice with wisdom and mercy. Now let me pause here for just a second. I need to ask you something. Have you ever experienced a loss so profound that you couldn't think straight? Have you ever been in that place where grief takes over and you just need to be close to the person you lost? Leave me a comment because I actually read them. And if you're feeling this story, if it's touching you the way it touched me, hit that like button for me. I looked at Mrs. Mitchell standing there so small and fragile before my bench. I thought about my own father's funeral 20 years ago. I remembered standing at his grave after everyone had left, not wanting to walk away because walking away meant accepting he was really gone. I remembered my wife finding me there hours later, just standing in the cold, unable to move. I understood exactly what this woman had been going through. I made my decision in that moment. I picked up my gavel, but I didn't strike it yet. I said, "Mrs. Mitchell, I want you to listen to me very carefully. You did nothing wrong, nothing. You were a grieving widow seeking comfort in the only way you knew how. You were trying to feel close to your husband one more time. That is not a crime. That is not something that deserves punishment. That is human. That is what love looks like when it has nowhere else to go." I saw her eyes widen slightly. I saw hope flicker there for the first time since she'd walked.
Pause for a second. This is where this story becomes more than just a courtroom anecdote. Judges technically don't have to care about your emotions. The law allows discretion, but it doesn't demand compassion. What you're about to hear is a judge choosing humanity over autopilot, and that choice changes everything. Keep watching, because this is where justice stops being paperwork and starts being personal.
Into my courtroom, I continued, "This citation is dismissed. You owe nothing. Not $75, not 75 cents, not one single penny. You've paid enough. You've suffered enough. This court will not add to your burden." I brought the gavel down with a sharp crack that echoed through the silent courtroom. Mrs. Mitchell stood there, and for a moment I wasn't sure she had understood me. Then I saw her shoulders begin to shake. The tears that had been falling quietly became sobs, deep, wrenching sobs that came from the very center of her grief. But I could see they were different now. They weren't just tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of feeling seen and understood in a moment when she probably felt completely alone in the world. Christina immediately stepped forward with a box of tissues. Mrs. Mitchell took several and pressed them to her face. I waited. I've learned over the years that sometimes people need a moment to let it all out, especially in a place where they thought they'd find more judgment and punishment. When she finally looked up at me, she said something I'll never forget. She said, "Thank you, Your Honor. Thank you for understanding. Thank you for seeing me as a person and not just a case number." I nodded to her and I said, "Mrs. Mitchell, you are not a case number. You are a woman who loved her husband for 32 years and lost him too soon. You are a mother and a grandmother doing her best to hold it together when everything is falling apart. That's who you are. And I want you to know something else." I paused to make sure she was listening. "Your husband would be very proud of you. Coming here today, facing this, when I'm sure all you wanted to do was stay in bed and hide from the world, that takes courage. You honor his memory with that courage." She smiled through her tears, a small broken smile that somehow held a glimmer of light. "He always said I was stronger than I knew," she whispered. I smiled back at her. "He was right," I said. "Now you go home, you take care of yourself, you lean on your children and your grandchildren, and you take all the time you need to grieve and heal. This court case is over." She thanked me again 3 or 4 times, and then she turned and walked back down the aisle. I watched her go, and I saw several people in the gallery reach out to touch her shoulder or hand as she passed. Small gestures of comfort from strangers who had witnessed something real and human in a courtroom. After she left, I sat there for a moment before calling the next case. I thought about the parking enforcement officer who had written that ticket. I understood he was doing his job. I understood that rules exist for a reason. But I also understood that rules without compassion become tyranny. Laws without mercy become oppression. My father taught me that. He said the letter of the law is important, but the spirit of the law is what matters. The spirit is about fairness, about decency, about recognizing that we're all human and we all stumble and fall sometimes. I called the next case, and then the next, moving through the morning docket. But my mind kept returning to Sarah Mitchell. I kept seeing her face, the pain in her eyes, the way her whole body seemed to carry the weight of her grief. And I kept thinking about that parking ticket written at 5:37 in the morning outside a cemetery gate. What kind of society do we live in where that happens? What kind of system are we running? At noon, we broke for lunch. I went back to my chambers and sat at my desk with the sandwich Joyce had packed for me that morning, but I couldn't eat. I kept thinking about the case. Christina knocked on my door and came in. She looked at me and said, "That was the right call, Judge." I nodded. "I know it was," I said, "but it makes me angry, Christina. It makes me angry that she had to come here at all. It makes me angry that nobody along the way, from the officer who wrote the ticket to the clerk who processed it, nobody stopped and said,
Let that sink in. 5:37 a.m. outside a cemetery, less than 12 hours after a funeral. This is the exact moment where systems fail people. The officer followed the rulebook perfectly and still did the wrong thing. Here's the uncomfortable question. Should enforcing the law ever override basic human decency? Drop your thoughts in the comments because this is where opinions split fast.
"Wait a minute, this isn't right." Christina sat down across from me. She's been with me long enough to know when I need to talk something through. "You can't fix the whole system," she said gently, "but you can make sure that in your courtroom, compassion wins. You did that today. That woman will never forget what you did for her." I knew Christina was right, but I also knew I wanted to do more. That afternoon, I made a phone call to the parking enforcement department. I spoke to the supervisor and I explained what had happened. I wasn't angry. I didn't yell, but I did make it very clear that citations like this one reflect poorly on all of us. I said, "We have the discretion to be human beings first and enforcement officers second. Please remind your people of that." The supervisor listened and promised to review their training and policies. I don't know if anything changed after that call, but at least I tried. I'm going to be honest with you. Cases like Sarah Mitchell's are exactly why I still put on these robes every morning after 40 years, because I can make a difference in someone's life. I can take a terrible situation and make it just a little bit better. I can remind people that the system isn't all cold bureaucracy, that there are still human beings making decisions, and that those human beings have hearts. If you believe that matters, if you think compassion should be part of justice, hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed, because I have more stories like this, stories that will restore your faith in what the law can be when it's administered with wisdom and mercy. That evening when I got home, Joyce asked me how my day was. We were sitting at the kitchen table having dinner, just the two of us, like we've done for nearly 50 years. I told her about Sarah Mitchell. I told her about the parking ticket and the funeral in the cemetery. Joyce got tears in her eyes. She reached across the table and took my hand. She said, Frank, that woman needed you today. She needed someone to tell her she hadn't done anything wrong, that her grief was valid, that she wasn't going to be punished for loving her husband. Joyce always knows exactly how to name what I'm feeling. I thought about Mrs. Mitchell a lot in the days after that. I wondered how she was doing. I wondered if she was finding her way through the fog of grief. I've learned over the years that grief doesn't follow a timeline. It doesn't care about your schedule or your obligations. It comes in waves, sometimes gentle, sometimes crushing, and all you can do is ride them out and trust that eventually the waves will get smaller and farther apart. About 3 weeks later, I was in my chambers going through some paperwork when Christina came in with an envelope. She said, "Judge, this came for you." I looked at the return address and saw it was from Sarah Mitchell. I opened it carefully and pulled out a handwritten letter on simple stationery. The handwriting was shaky but legible. I want to read you part of what she wrote because it meant more to me than almost anything I've received in my career. She wrote, "Dear Judge Caprio, I hope you don't mind me writing to you. I wanted you to know what your kindness meant to me. The morning I came to your courtroom, I honestly didn't know if I could go on. I was drowning in grief and overwhelmed by all the things I suddenly had to handle alone. When that officer gave me the parking ticket while I sat at my husband's grave, it felt like the universe was telling me it didn't care about my pain, that I still had to follow all the rules, even though my world had ended. I went to court that day expecting more of the same, more cold bureaucracy, more being treated like a number. But you saw me. You really saw me. You understood. And when you dismissed that ticket, it wasn't really about the $75. It was about someone in a position of authority telling me I wasn't crazy, I wasn't wrong, my grief mattered. You gave me permission to be human in my darkest hour. I will never forget that." I had to stop reading for a moment. I took off my glasses and wiped my eyes. I'm not ashamed to tell you, I cried reading that letter. After 40 years on the bench, you'd think I'd have thicker skin, but I don't. I don't ever want thicker skin, if it means I stop feeling the weight and the gift of this work. Her letter continued, "I wanted you to know that I'm doing better. Some days are still very hard, but I'm finding my way. My daughter convinced me to join a grief support group at the community center, and that's helping. I'm learning that grief is love with nowhere to go, and that's okay. It means I love deeply, and that's not something to be ashamed of. You helped me understand that. Thank you for your compassion. Thank you for reminding me that there are still good people in the world who care. I will be forever grateful. Sincerely, Sarah Mitchell." I folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. Then I placed it in my desk drawer where I keep the things that matter most. Letters from people whose lives I've touched, photos of my family, a prayer card from my father's funeral, the things that remind me why I do this job and who I want to be as a judge and as a man. That night at dinner, I told Joyce about the letter. She listened with that patient, loving attention she's given me for nearly 5 decades. When I finished, she said something profound. She said, "Frank, you showed her mercy, but more than that, you showed her dignity. You treated her like her pain mattered. That's what she'll remember. Not that you dismissed a parking ticket, but that you acknowledged her suffering and responded with love." Joyce has always been wiser than me. I started thinking more broadly about the role of compassion and justice. I've been doing this for 40 years, and I've seen the system work beautifully, and I've seen it fail miserably. The times it fails are usually when we forget that laws are meant to serve people, not the other way around. The times it succeeds are when judges, lawyers, police officers, and everyone else in the system remembers that we're dealing with human beings who are complicated, flawed, struggling, and worthy of dignity. I thought about some of the other cases I've handled where compassion made all the difference. I thought about the single mother who couldn't pay her parking tickets because she was working 2 jobs to keep food on the table for her kids. I dismissed her fines and connected her with social services that could help. I thought about the elderly man with dementia who kept getting lost and driving the wrong way on one-way streets. Instead of taking away his license immediately and leaving him isolated, I worked with his family to arrange transportation and community support. I thought about the young man with an addiction who kept appearing before me for possession charges. Instead of just sending him to jail repeatedly, I got him into a drug court program where he could get treatment. Last I heard, he's been sober for 3 years and has a job and an apartment. These cases remind me that justice isn't one size fits all. It can't be. Every person who stands before me brings their whole life story with them. They bring their traumas and their triumphs, their strengths and their weaknesses, their good days and their worst days. My job is to see all of that, to understand it as best I can, and to make a decision that serves both the law and the person before me. Before I go further, let me ask you this. Do you think the legal system has enough compassion in it? Do you think judges should have the flexibility to consider individual circumstances, or should the law be applied the same way every single time, regardless of context? I'm genuinely curious what you think. Leave me a comment with your thoughts. And if you're getting something out of this story, if it's making you think about justice differently, hit that subscribe button and that like button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. The thing is, showing compassion doesn't mean ignoring the law. It doesn't mean letting people off the hook for genuinely harmful behavior. It means understanding context. It means recognizing that not every violation is equal, that circumstances matter, that intent matters, that the human story behind the action matters. When someone parks illegally because they're rushing into a store to buy beer, that's different from someone parking illegally because they're sitting outside a cemetery grieving their spouse. The law might say both are violations, but justice requires us to see the difference. I've had critics over the years who say I'm too soft, that I let people manipulate me with sob stories, that I'm not upholding the law properly. I hear those criticisms, and I understand where they come from. But here's what I know after 4 decades doing this work. Mercy and accountability aren't opposites. You can hold people accountable while also treating them with compassion. You can uphold the law while also recognizing extenuating circumstances. And you can be firm when firmness is needed without being cruel. I've also handled cases where compassion meant being tough. I remember a man who came before me for his 7th DUI. 7 times he had gotten behind the wheel drunk and endangered innocent people. He stood there asking for one more chance, telling me he had a problem, asking for mercy. I looked him in the eye and I said, I'm giving you mercy right now by taking your license permanently and sending you to jail. Mercy for all the people you could kill the next time you drink and drive. Mercy for your family who loves you and doesn't want to bury you. And mercy for you because you need to be stopped before you destroy yourself completely. That's compassion too. Sometimes love means saying no. Sometimes mercy means protection even when it feels harsh. But Sarah Mitchell's case was different. There was no public safety issue. There was no pattern of disregard for the law. There was just a grieving widow trying to feel close to her husband one more time, and a system that punished her for it without thinking. That's where discretion comes in. That's where a judge earns their robes by thinking beyond the citation in front of them. Several months after I dismissed Mrs. Mitchell's case, I was invited to speak at a conference for municipal court judges from across the state. The organizers asked me to talk about judicial discretion and compassion. I accepted immediately because this is a subject I'm passionate about. I prepared my remarks carefully, and I decided to tell Sarah Mitchell's story, with her permission, of course. I had reached out to her and asked if she'd be comfortable with me sharing what happened, and she said she'd be honored if it could help other judges think differently about their role. Standing before a room full of my colleagues, I told them about that March morning. I told them about the parking ticket written at dawn outside a cemetery. I told them about Mrs. Mitchell standing in my courtroom, barely holding herself together, and I told them about my decision to dismiss the case. The room was quiet when I finished. Then a judge from Newport raised his hand and asked, "But what about the law? What about equal treatment under the law? If you dismiss her ticket, don't you have to dismiss everyone's ticket?" It was a fair question, and I appreciated it. I said no, because circumstances matter. Context matters. Equal treatment doesn't mean identical treatment. It means each person gets the consideration and justice their individual situation requires. Mrs. Mitchell's case was extraordinary. She wasn't trying to cheat the system or avoid responsibility. She was grieving. The law must have room for human tragedy, or it stops being justice and becomes mere punishment. Another judge, an older man I'd known for years, stood up and said, "Frank, I think what you did was exactly right. We've gotten so caught up in efficiency, in clearing our dockets, in processing cases quickly, that we've forgotten to see the people before us. Thank you for reminding us why we took this job in the first place." Several other judges nodded in agreement. I felt grateful to be among colleagues who understood that our work is as much about wisdom as it is about law. After the conference, several judges approached me privately to share their own stories of cases where compassion had made the difference. A judge from Warwick told me about a veteran with PTSD who kept getting citations for expired registration. Instead of piling on fines, he connected the veteran with services that helped him get the support and organization he needed. A judge from Pawtucket told me about a teenager caught shoplifting who was actually stealing food because her family was hungry. Instead of prosecution, she arranged for the family to get emergency food assistance and job placement services. These stories reminded me that I'm not alone in believing justice requires a human touch. You know what keeps me doing this job after 40 years? Moments like these, knowing that I'm part of a system that, at its best, doesn't just punish, but also heals. A system that recognizes human dignity. A system that can look at a grieving widow and say, "We see you, we understand, and we're not going to make your life harder. If this story is restoring your faith in justice, show me by hitting that subscribe button and that like button. Tell me in the comments if you've ever experienced compassion from someone in authority when you needed it most." I think often about what my father would say if he could see me now. He died 20 years ago, but his voice is still in my head, guiding me. He was a simple man, a construction worker who never went to college, but he had a wisdom that came from a hard life lived with integrity. He used to tell me, "Frank, when you have the power to make someone's day better or worse, always choose better, always. It costs you nothing and it means everything to them." I try to live by that principle in every case I've handled. I've dismissed fines for people who genuinely couldn't pay them. I've arranged payment plans for people struggling financially. I've connected people with social services, job programs, addiction treatment, mental health resources. I've tried to see beyond the citation or charge to the human being who needs help, not just punishment. But I've also been firm when needed. I've thrown the book at drunk drivers who showed no remorse. I've been tough on people who showed a pattern of disregard for others' safety. I've held people accountable for their choices, because compassion doesn't mean there are no consequences. It means the consequences are proportionate, fair, and delivered with respect for human dignity. Sarah Mitchell's case taught me something I should have already known but needed to be reminded of. Grief is not a crime. Suffering is not an offense. Being human in a moment of overwhelming pain is not something that deserves punishment. Our legal system sometimes forgets that. It gets so caught up in rules and procedures that it loses sight of the people those rules are supposed to serve. I want to tell you about something else that happened about 6 months after I dismissed Mrs. Mitchell's ticket. I was at the grocery store on a Saturday morning, doing the shopping Joyce had asked me to do. I was in the produce section, trying to figure out which avocados were ripe, when I heard someone say, "Judge Caprio?" I turned around and saw Sarah Mitchell standing there with her shopping cart. She looked different than she had in my courtroom. She still had sadness in her eyes, that kind of sadness that never fully leaves after you lose someone you love. But she also looked lighter somehow, like she'd found a way to carry the weight. I smiled and said hello. She came over and took my hand. "I wanted to thank you again," she said. "Not just for dismissing the ticket, but for treating me like I mattered. I've thought about that day so many times, about your kindness. It helped me more than you know." I told her I was just doing my job the way it should be done. She shook her head. "No," she said, "you did it the way it should be done. Most people just do their job. There's a difference." We talked for a few minutes there in the produce section. She told me her daughter had just had another baby, her third grandchild.
This is what real judicial discretion looks like. Not favoritism, not weakness. This is the law working the way it was intended, with wisdom. Ask yourself, if you were sitting on that bench, would you have done the same thing? Or would you have hidden behind rules or rules? Hit like if you believe justice should still have a heart.
She told me she'd gone back to work part-time as a librarian. She told me she'd started volunteering at a grief support group, helping other people who were walking the path she'd walked. "I figured if I could help someone else the way you helped me," she said, "then maybe some good could come from all this pain." I felt my eyes get misty right there next to the avocados. This woman, who had stood in my courtroom 6 months earlier, barely able to speak through her tears, was now using her pain to help others. That's the resilience of the human spirit. That's what we're capable of when we're treated with dignity and compassion instead of coldness and bureaucracy. Before we parted ways, she said something I'll never forget. She said, "Judge, you gave me back my faith that day. Faith that the world isn't all cruel. Faith that there are still people who care. Faith that I could get through this. Thank you for that gift." I hugged her right there in the store, something I rarely do, but it felt like the right thing in that moment. When we stepped back, we were both crying a little, and I didn't care who saw. Driving home that day, I thought about the ripple effects of our actions. I had taken 2 minutes in my courtroom to show compassion to a grieving widow. It cost me nothing. It cost the city nothing, but it meant everything to her. And now she was taking that compassion and multiplying it, sharing it with others in grief support groups, passing it forward. One small act of mercy had created waves that would touch people I'd never meet. That's the power we have when we choose kindness. I also thought about all the times the system doesn't work this way. All the people who fall through the cracks because nobody takes the time to see them. All the cases that get processed mechanically without anyone asking, "Wait, what's the story here? What are the circumstances?" I wondered how many Sarah Mitchells are out there who didn't have the luck to appear before a judge willing to exercise compassion. That thought made me sad and angry. We can do better. We must do better. Look, I need to ask you for a favor. If this story is resonating with you, if you're seeing the importance of compassion in our legal system, I need you to share this. Send it to someone who works in law enforcement or the courts. Send it to someone who's going through grief. Send it to someone who needs to be reminded that there are still good people trying to do the right thing. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the other stories I'm going to share, and leave me a comment telling me what you think. Do you think I did the right thing? Would you have done the same? As my career has gone on, I've become more and more convinced that the best legal outcomes happen when we combine the head and the heart. The head understands the law, knows the statutes, recognizes the need for order and consequences. The heart understands suffering, recognizes humanity, sees the person beneath the case number. Both are necessary. A judge who operates only from the head becomes mechanical and cruel. A judge who operates only from the heart becomes arbitrary and loses credibility. But when you combine both, when you apply the law with wisdom and compassion, that's when justice truly happens. I've trained younger judges over the years, and this is what I try to teach them. I tell them, read every file carefully, look beyond the charge to the circumstances, ask questions, listen to the answers, look people in the eye, see them, and then make your decision based on both the law and your understanding of what's just in this particular situation with this particular person. Some of them get it immediately. They understand that justice is an art as much as a science. Others struggle with it. They're so worried about being perceived as soft or being reversed on appeal that they apply the law rigidly without consideration for context. I understand that fear. Early in my career, I had it too. But I learned that the cases I'm most proud of, the ones that let me sleep well at night, are the ones where I had the courage to use my discretion in service of true justice, even if it meant going beyond the strict letter of the law. Sarah Mitchell's case is one of those cases. I could have looked at that citation, applied the fine, and moved on. It would have taken 30 seconds. Nobody would have criticized me, but I would have added to the suffering of a woman who was already drowning in pain. And for what? To prove that rules are rules? To show that the law is inflexible? No. That's not justice. That's bureaucratic cruelty masquerading as law enforcement. I want you to think about something. How many times in your life have you needed mercy? How many times have you made a mistake, been in a bad situation, or just had a terrible day and needed someone to give you a break? Most of us, if we're honest, can think of multiple times. I know I can. I think about the teacher who gave me extra time on a test when my mother was sick. I think about the police officer who gave me a warning instead of a speeding ticket when I was rushing to the hospital after my father had a heart attack. I think about the bank manager who worked with me when I fell behind on my mortgage early in my marriage and Joyce and I were struggling. Those acts of mercy didn't undermine the rules. They acknowledged that I was a human being having a hard time and that rules should serve people, not crush them. Those people could have been rigid. They could have said, rules are rules, no exceptions. But they didn't. They saw me. They exercised discretion. They chose compassion, and I never forgot it. Their kindness shaped how I try to treat others now that I'm in a position of authority. This is what I tried to do for Sarah Mitchell. I saw her. I understood her circumstances. I exercised the discretion I have as a judge, and I chose compassion, not because I'm some kind of saint, but because it was the right thing to do, because the law allows for it, because justice demanded it. I've been asked many times over the years what I'm most proud of in my career. People expect me to name some high-profile case or some legal precedent I set, but honestly, I'm most proud of the small moments of compassion. The single mother whose fines I dismissed so she could feed her kids. The elderly man I helped get dementia care instead of just punishing his traffic violations. The young addict I got into treatment instead of just jail. And Sarah Mitchell, the grieving widow I refused to punish for loving her husband. These aren't the cases that make headlines. They're not the ones that will be taught in law schools, but they're the ones that matter. They're the ones that remind me why I became a judge in the first place. Not to wield power, but to serve justice. Not to punish, but to make things right. Not to follow rules blindly, but to apply them with wisdom and heart. Let me tell you something else about compassion in the courtroom. It's not weakness. I've heard that criticism before. Judge Caprio is too soft. He lets people off too easy. But that's not accurate. Compassion is not the same as being a pushover. I've sent people to jail when they deserved it. I've imposed stiff fines when behavior warranted it. I've been tough when toughness was needed. But I've always tried to see the full picture first. I've always tried to understand before I judge. And yes, when I see genuine hardship, genuine suffering, genuine human pain, I err on the side of mercy, because I'd rather face criticism for being too compassionate than face my own conscience for being needlessly cruel. There's a quote I love by the writer Frederick Buechner. He said, Compassion is the sometimes fatal capacity for feeling what it's like to live inside somebody else's skin. It is the knowledge that there can never really be any peace and joy for me until there is peace and joy finally for you too. That's what I try to bring to every case, the capacity to imagine what it's like to be the person standing before me, to feel even briefly the weight they're carrying, and to make my decisions based on that understanding. When Sarah Mitchell stood in my courtroom, I tried to imagine what she was feeling, the emptiness of losing your life partner, the exhaustion of planning a funeral, the pain of seeing his grave for the first time, the loneliness of sitting in a car at dawn with nowhere else to go, the humiliation of getting a ticket in that moment, the dread of having to appear in court the day after burying your husband. When I put myself in her shoes, even for a moment, the decision became clear. This woman needed compassion, not punishment. I'm going to pause here one more time and ask you something important. In your life, when you have the choice between being harsh and being kind, between enforcing a rule and showing mercy, which do you choose? I'm not talking about when there's danger or when someone is genuinely harmful. I'm talking about the everyday moments when you have power over someone else's experience, the moment you could give someone grace or give them grief. What do you choose? Think about that. And if you believe that choosing kindness whenever possible makes the world better, hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the other stories I have to share. Stories about what happens when we choose our better angels. You know, I'm 82 years old now. I've been doing this work since before many of you were born. And I've learned that at the end of the day, the only things that really matter are how we treated people and whether we made the world a little bit better or a little bit worse with our time here. The cases I remember, the ones that stay with me, aren't necessarily the most legally complex. They're the ones where I got to be fully human, where I got to use my position not to dominate but to serve, where I got to look someone in the eye and say, I see you, I understand, and I'm going to help. Sarah Mitchell gave me that opportunity. She walked into my courtroom carrying an unbearable burden, and I got to lighten it, even if just a little. I got to send her home knowing that the system wasn't going to kick her while she was down. I got to remind her that there's still goodness in the world, still people who care, still hope even in the darkest times. That's a gift. She gave me as much as I gave her. I also think about the message that case sent to everyone else in the courtroom that day. The 20 or so people sitting in the gallery who witnessed that interaction, they saw a judge treat someone with dignity and respect. They saw compassion in action. They saw that the legal system can work the way it should. Maybe some of them went home and told their families about what they'd seen. Maybe some of them were a little kinder to someone that day because they'd witnessed kindness. Maybe the ripples extended even further than I know. I hope so. This is why I believe so strongly in the concept of restorative justice, in the idea that our system should be about healing and making things right, not just about punishment. Don't misunderstand me. Some people need to be punished. Some behaviors require serious consequences. But many cases, maybe most cases, are opportunities for restoration, for education, for compassion, for helping people get back on track rather than just knocking them down further. Sarah Mitchell didn't need to be punished. She needed to be seen and supported. The parking ticket wasn't going to teach her anything except that the system is cruel. Dismissing it taught her that compassion still exists, that people still care, that she wasn't alone. Which lesson is more valuable? Which one makes our society better? I wish every judge, every police officer, every government official who interacts with the public would ask themselves that question. What is this person really being taught by how I treat them? Am I teaching them that the system is fair and compassionate, or am I teaching them that the system is cold and punitive? Am I building trust or destroying it? Am I part of the solution or part of the problem? These are the questions that keep me up at night sometimes, because I know the system doesn't always work the way it should. I know there are judges who are harsh for the sake of being harsh. I know there are officers who enforce the letter of the law without any consideration for circumstances. I know there are bureaucrats who say, I'm just doing my job, without thinking about the human impact of that job. and I know that those failures erode public trust, create cynicism, and make the world a little bit colder. But I also know there are wonderful people throughout the system who get it right, who lead with compassion, who see the humans before them, who use their power wisely and with mercy. I've met so many of them over the years, and they give me hope that we can do better, that we can be better, that the system can serve its highest purpose of creating justice and healing rather than just punishment and pain. So let me ask you this. Do you think I was too harsh on the parking enforcement officer who wrote that ticket, or not harsh enough? Should there be consequences for officials who exercise their power without compassion? I'm genuinely curious what you think. And here's another question. If you were in my position that morning, what would you have done? Would you have dismissed the ticket like I did? Or would you have applied the fine because rules are rules? Leave me a comment with your honest thoughts. I read every single one, and I learned from them. One thing I want to be clear about is that I don't think I'm special for what I did. I don't think I deserve any particular praise for showing basic human decency. This should be the standard, not the exception. Every judge should be thinking this way. Every person with power over others should be exercising that power with wisdom and compassion. The fact that it's noteworthy when someone does is actually kind of sad. It means we've normalized cruelty and bureaucratic indifference to such a degree that kindness stands out. We can do better than that. We must do better than that. And it starts with each of us in whatever position we hold, making the choice to see people, to understand their circumstances, and to respond with compassion whenever possible. If you're a teacher, it means understanding that the kid who didn't do his homework might be dealing with chaos at home. If you're a boss, it means recognizing that the employee who's been off lately might be going through something difficult. If you're a customer service representative, it means treating even the angriest customer with patience and humanity. If you're a judge, it means looking beyond the citation to the person standing before you. This is how we change the world, not with grand gestures, but with small acts of compassion multiplied across millions of interactions every day. Sarah Mitchell's case was one small moment in one small courtroom in Providence, Rhode Island. But it mattered to her. And it matters to everyone who hears this story and maybe thinks a little differently about how they use whatever power they have. I'm going to tell you one more thing about that case, and then I want to get to my final thoughts. About a year after I dismissed Mrs. Mitchell's ticket, I was honored by the Rhode Island Bar Association for my years of service. It was a nice ceremony, a lot of kind words, a plaque for my office. At the reception afterward, a woman approached me, who I didn't recognize at first. Then I realized it was Sarah Mitchell. She was wearing a beautiful blue dress, and she had color in her cheeks. She looked like a person who had found her way back to life. She told me she'd read about the ceremony in the paper and wanted to come thank me in person one more time. But she also wanted to tell me something. She said, "Judge, I started a scholarship fund in my husband's name. It's for people who are facing financial hardship due to medical bills or funeral expenses. We raised enough money to give out 3 scholarships this year to help people pay their bills and get back on their feet. And I want you to know the inspiration for that fund was you. The kindness you showed me, I wanted to pass it on. I wanted to multiply it. I was speechless. This woman had taken the compassion I'd shown her and turned it into something that would help countless other people. She'd taken her pain and transformed it into purpose. She'd taken the mercy she received and magnified it. That's the power of compassion. It doesn't just help the immediate recipient. It creates a ripple effect that extends far beyond what we can see or measure. I hugged her again, and I told her how proud I was of her, how her husband would be proud, how she was honoring his memory in the most beautiful way. She smiled and said, "I learned from the best." I don't think I'm the best, not by a long shot, but I'm grateful that something I did on one random Tuesday morning ended up creating something so meaningful. That scholarship fund is still operating today, 5 years later, It's helped dozens of families who were drowning in medical debt or funeral costs. It's kept people in their homes. It's allowed parents to keep feeding their children. It's prevented financial catastrophe for people who were hanging on by a thread. And it all started because I chose compassion over bureaucracy in my courtroom one morning. That's what I mean when I say our small choices matter. So here's what I want to leave you with. Whether you're a judge or a teacher, a police officer or a parent, a boss or a friend, you have power in people's lives. You have the ability to make their day better or worse, to see them or ignore them, to show compassion or withhold it. Choose carefully, choose wisely, choose with your heart as well as your head, because those choices ripple out in ways you'll never fully see. They shape lives. They change trajectories. They teach lessons. They create the world we all have to live in. If this story meant something to you, if you believe in equal justice tempered with mercy like I do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Turn on that bell icon so you never miss another story from my courtroom. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message, someone who's going through a hard time, someone who works in law enforcement or the courts, someone who believes that character matters more than cash, that compassion matters more than rules, that people matter more than procedures. And check out the next video on your screen. I've got another incredible story from my courtroom that you won't believe. It's about a veteran who appeared before me, and what happened next changed both of our lives. I promise you'll want to see it. I'm Frank Caprio. I've been on this bench for 40 years because I believe something simple. We're all equal before the law, every single one of us, rich or poor, powerful or powerless. And that law should be applied with wisdom, with discretion, and with compassion. Because we're not just enforcing rules, we're serving justice. And justice without mercy isn't really justice at all. It's just punishment. And punishment alone has never healed anyone or made the world better. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for caring about these things. Thank you for believing, like I do, that we can do better, be better, and create a system that serves the highest ideals of human dignity and compassion. God bless you. Take care of each other. Show kindness whenever you can. And remember, respect costs nothing, but it's worth everything. I'll see you tomorrow with another story, another lesson, another reminder of why this work matters. Until then, be good to each other.